On a quiet afternoon on July 13th, 1944, in a modest Boston apartment, a man who once dazzled the world with his intellect died in near-total obscurity. His name was William James Sidis. He was 46 years old. His IQ was estimated to be between 250 and 300, significantly higher than Einstein's, which was around 200. The New York Times reported his death with a brief headline: W.J. Sidis, 46, child prodigy, dies. Physicist rejected world's favors. For those who had followed his remarkable early life, the news was a sad but unsurprising coda to a story that had once held so much promise. Born on April 1st, 1898, William James Sidis came into the world with a brilliance that would set him apart from others almost immediately. His parents, Boris and Sarah Sidis, were Ukrainian Jewish immigrants who fled the turmoil of their homeland to seek a better life in America. They were not ordinary immigrants. Both were highly educated and intellectually driven. Boris, a prominent psychologist, was fascinated by the potential of the human mind, while Sarah was one of the few women of her time to have graduated from medical school. William was named after his godfather, Boris's friend and colleague, the American philosopher William James. Boris used some of his psychological principles to help mold his son. He said, "You know the old saying, as the twig is bent, the tree's inclined." Parents cannot too soon begin the work of bending the minds of their children in the right direction. William's parents believed his remarkable intelligence was the result of his upbringing rather than genetics. From infancy, they treated him as if he were an adult. When William was just a few months old, his parents placed food and a spoon in front of him. They allowed him to observe, and he taught himself how to eat. His mother remembered, he squealed with delight. No one had taught him. He had reasoned it out. By the time William was just 18 months old, he could read the New York Times. At the age of 8, he had taught himself 8 languages, including Latin, Greek, and French. He even created his own language, Vendergood, a complex tongue with its own grammar and syntax. For William, learning was not a challenge, but a natural extension of his being, as instinctive as breathing. William had little interest in toys or sports, and he never participated in games during recess. His father dismissed these activities as pointless and childish. Oddly enough, William had a deep fear of dogs. His only real joy came from riding streetcars, a treat he enjoyed when his parents took him to museums, libraries, parks, and zoos. By his 20s, he had amassed a collection of 1,600 streetcar transfers. William's academic journey was extraordinary. He completed elementary school in less than a year and finished high school in just 6 weeks. Reflecting on this, his mother remarked, "The newspapers never missed an opportunity to suggest he was insane, psychotic, or just a freak. But in reality, Billy was a perfectly normal child in every way." Boris and Sarah pushed William relentlessly, convinced that their rigorous intellectual regimen would mold him into a genius. Their methods were unconventional, even harsh. Boris believed in early childhood education to an extreme degree, employing techniques that were criticized by some as bordering on child abuse. But the results were undeniable. At the age of 9, William applied for Harvard University. Though initially denied due to his age, he was admitted 2 years later, making him the youngest student ever to enroll at the prestigious institution. The media followed William James Sidis to Harvard, casting him as a know-it-all, as seen in a New Yorker cartoon where he's depicted lecturing a group of men. At just 11, he gave a lecture to the math club about the fourth dimension, discussing shapes with many sides, demonstrating his exceptional grasp of complex mathematical concepts. A professor from MIT who attended the talk predicted Sidis would become a great astronomical mathematician. However, things took a different turn. Soon after the lecture, Sidis fell ill, and rumors of a mental breakdown began to circulate, rumors that would haunt him for life. After several months of absence, he returned to Harvard, but he never truly fit in. His biographer, Amy Wallace, noted that he was seen as a complete outcast by his peers, lacking social skills and interest in typical teenage pursuits. Upon graduating, Sidis declared his desire to live the perfect life, one of seclusion and freedom from crowds. His idea of the perfect life is described in a paper he wrote on a utopian society called Hesperia. Hesperia's constitution begins with, "We, the people," reminiscent of the U.S. Constitution. But that was where the similarities end. In Hesperia, those who want citizenship have to pass an intelligence test. Marriage is forbidden, while polygamy is completely legal. Interestingly, children are not raised by their biological parents, and instead, male children shall be assigned to the charge of male guardians, and female children to the charge of female guardians. William's prodigious mind, so adept at grasping complex theories, struggled with the simple social interactions that most of us take for granted. He was isolated, unable to relate to his peers, who were years older and far less intellectually advanced. The pressures of fame, combined with the unrealistic expectations placed upon him by his parents and the public, began to take their toll. By the time he graduated cum laude at the age of 16, the bright-eyed child who had once reveled in his own brilliance had begun to retreat into himself. After Harvard, William sought a quieter life. He taught briefly at Rice University, but found the experience intolerable. Students ridiculed him for his lack of romantic experience, and he stayed for only 8 months before enrolling at Harvard Law. But in a surprising move, he quit just before graduating. His mother was furious, telling people that World War I had shut down Harvard Law. But this wasn't true. Sidis's anti-war stance nearly landed him in prison when he refused to register for the draft, and his political passions led him to an anti-war rally that turned violent. During his brief time in jail, Sidis fell in love with Martha Foley, an Irish woman from Boston. Despite his earlier vow to remain celibate, he followed her to New York. Although their romance was brief, Sidis carried a photograph of Martha until his death, hinting at a lifelong longing for unrequited love. Martha went on to marry a writer and achieve notoriety for co-founding the literary magazine Story. When her memoirs were published, she briefly mentioned William in a single line, in which she called him the famous and tragic prodigy who was the first boy ever to pay court to me. In 1925, he published a book that challenged the second law of thermodynamics, the principle that the universe is headed toward heat death, where all energy is evenly spread out, so there won't be any energy left to power any processes. In this state, nothing will move, change, or live. In the animate and the inanimate, he explored the possibility of reversing the universe's direction. He theorized that living things could tap into a hidden source of energy to counteract the process. He gave an example of a ball bouncing down the stairs, which, when played in reverse on film, appears as if a hidden source of energy is pushing the ball up the stairs. He did acknowledge that his work was speculative and his theory has never been proven, but it was never taken seriously in the first place. It was ignored. There wasn't a single review during its time. He made headlines for being a boy prodigy and for his private life, yet no one paid attention to his academic work. He stopped writing about physics, math, and cosmology altogether. While in New York, he took on menial jobs, including working as an operator in an office that was using an early mechanical calculator called a comptometer. The papers were all too keen to splash headlines about the boy wonder earning an average wage of $23 a week. He hid his genius from his coworkers. When they found out who he was, he'd move on to the next job. He refused to accept higher-paying work in which he had to use his intellect. Once he was offered a job with a railway company that tried to put him to work solving their technical problems. One of the officials later found him crying. William told him he couldn't bear the thought of doing math. Another time, a cousin needed his math skills to help solve a dental problem involving the alignment of teeth. He offered William $3,000, the equivalent of $55,000 today. It would have taken him 2 hours to solve, but he refused. Instead, he lived in boarding houses, making $25 a week doing jobs he despised. He died in one such room in 1944, aged 46. His family had no idea of his whereabouts until the authorities informed them of his death. His sister said he would run away whenever his parents came to visit him. The New York Times wrote an article about him with the headline, W.J. Sidis, 46, child prodigy, dies. Physicists rejected world's favors. William's relationship with his family, particularly his father, deteriorated over the years. Boris's relentless push for his son's intellectual development had left deep scars. When Boris died in 1923, William did not attend the funeral. He remained close to his mother, but their relationship was fraught with tension. Sarah never gave up hope that her son would return to academia, and reclaim his place as one of the world's great minds. But William had no interest in such a life. As the years passed, William became increasingly reclusive. He avoided public attention, moving from one city to another, always seeking anonymity. He wrote under pseudonyms, published in obscure journals, and maintained a low profile. To the outside world, he was a forgotten genius, a man who had once held the promise of greatness, but had chosen a path of deliberate obscurity. In the last years of his life, William settled in Boston, living alone in a small apartment. His health deteriorated, and he suffered from a series of ailments, including high blood pressure and liver disease. He refused medical treatment, perhaps seeing it as just another imposition on the life he had chosen to lead. On July 13, 1944, William James Sidis died of a cerebral hemorrhage. His body was discovered by his landlady, who had grown concerned after not seeing him for several days. The news of his death was met with a brief flurry of media interest, but it quickly faded, much like William's own legacy. Today, William James Sidis is remembered as a tragic figure, a man whose immense potential was never fully realized. Some see him as a victim of overbearing parents in a society that could not accommodate his extraordinary intellect. Others view him as a cautionary tale, a reminder that genius, no matter how brilliant, is not immune to the pressures of the world. William once said that he wanted to live the perfect life, a life of peace and intellectual freedom. In his own way, perhaps he did. But in doing so, he chose to step away from a world that could have been his for the taking. He left behind a legacy not of the scientific achievements he was once expected to produce, but of a life lived on his own terms, however lonely and obscure those terms might have been. In the end, William James Sidis remains an enigma, a figure whose life was defined by both extraordinary brilliance and profound isolation. He is a reminder that genius, for all its potential, can also be a heavy burden, a burden that William ultimately chose to bear in solitude. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remain curious.